Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava, Batra, Daf Yomi. Today's daf is sponsored by Shiur in loving memory of her son, Eitan Dishon, who was killed in Gaza on the 20th of November. Today would have been his 22nd birthday. Among his belongings, they found his Gemara, with which he studied Daf Yomi, stained with blood. I understood that this was his legacy and began to study the Daf Yomi for the first time. I recently completed Bava Metzia, my first Masechet with Hadran. Okay, with that, we're going to get started with our daf. I mentioned on Friday that I would try to think over Shabbat about the connection between Eov, actually also the Tzedakah Sugyot, and the chapter in general about relationships with neighbors, and try to see if we can come up with some sort of connecting idea between the three. One theme I thought of, again, I think it needs further development, but at first glance, I was thinking that all three Sugyot really relate to universal themes. And in fact, it made me think because of the Eov, where really you felt like the Gemara was trying to say Eov lived in all times, and he wasn't necessarily Jewish, but this is a kind of universal theme of what everyone grapples with, right? Apropos the dedication of today's daf and what we're going through, this grappling of trying to figure out, how the world works and realizing that we don't really understand it properly, which also, if you connect to tzedakah, first of all, also in general, tzedakah is something that defies, it's not particularly unique to Judaism, it's a universal concept. And in fact, also it was interesting that our Sugyot also brought up how Gentiles fit in with that. Now, what does that have to do with our relations with our neighbors? Well, first of all, relations with neighbors is definitely a universal theme. And perhaps going back to Ayelet Lipson's introduction to the Masechet, where she talked about the fact that these issues have very little basis in the Torah. And yet, right, there's a whole Masechet about them, even though there's very little basis in the Torah, because they're these universal themes that even though the Torah doesn't have something particular to say about it, Judaism has a lot to say about it. And basically, the rabbis had to come up with what's our system and what's our method for dealing with these things, particularly when there's no psukim in the Torah about them. So perhaps that's the connection of these ideas, of these universal concepts that really exist, in these different realms. It's one connection. I'm sure you can work on thinking about more. Now, I want to go back to our Mishnah. We're going to start off with Lo Yachpor Adam Bor Samuch Lebaro Shel Chavero. So we have a first section of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah has a few sections. We're going to go through most of them today. So you can't dig a pit or do a bunch of other things next to, right, have any sort of water next to your friend's, your neighbor's pit. We then explain means, from the wall of the pit. And then really a lot of the commentaries say we also mean from a wall of your neighbor. Now, there's either a wall or a pit. Like, let's say there isn't a wall there, then it's the wall of your pit. If there is a wall, then it's the wall, because as we all know, water damage, right, can ruin walls, can ruin pits. It's not just that they're going to ruin pits, and therefore it's really next to any wall. If you notice, the next section of the Mishnah doesn't talk about a pit at all. It talks more about walls, okay? Right? So when it's water, they say we don't want you to ruin your friend's pit, and therefore we have to distance it a certain amount, because if it wears away at the wall, then the pit will, friend's pit will be ruined. But also if it's near a friend's wall. And then the next group of items weren't water related, but seemingly heat related. These things all create heat, okay? Whether it's the gefet, the dregs from the leftover remains of the olives, which are used for heating, the zevel, the fertilizer, which again, we assume that we're talking about a big pile of these. When they're piled together, it creates heat. Okay, salt and plaster or limestone and slaim and stones also can be sources of heat, or perhaps create chemical reactions that erode the wall, and therefore they have to be distanced 3 tvachim. Then the Mishnah, and then by the way, again, it's a bit of an issue with the virgins here. It's unclear what the exact version of the Mishnah is. And the first section seems to say you need to distance it and sabasid and plaster it. That's because of the water you need to seal it. The second section says or sabasid, but it's unclear. Some people had the version vis sabasid. It's not clear if there's a real distinction there in that halacha. We're going to deal with that question today. And then we get to these 3 items, which we don't really understand as well, which is the seeds, the plow. Okay, the plow makes sense, because if you start plowing right there, you're going to create a problem, right? Ruin the wall, and urine. Okay, so we'll get to those 3 things. The urine, it seems like it's not really the water, maybe something else, because otherwise it would be with all the water related issues. But they won't even discuss it so much. And the other thing, by the way, is forgot to mention is a review. When it said not to dig, some people think that when it says not to dig your pit, the issue is the digging of it. And it's because when you're digging, you create vibrations and movement in the soil, which could ruin the wall of your neighbor or the wall of the pit. So it's also a possibility that maybe it's not only talking about water damage and also this movement, which could create a problem, which might be similar to the plow. That's why I remembered it right now. Okay, and then we'll get to the rechaim and the tanur. That will be not today's daf. So let's start at the top of our daf right now, and we're going to start with the topic of nivrechet hakofsim. In the list, we're on the last one of the list of the water-related issues. So we have a pool that they would use for laundry, a launderer's pool. We're going to now see that there's two types of launderer's pools with different amounts of how far you need to distance them. By the way, I didn't really discuss this, but 3 tfachim is very small, okay? 3 handbreadths is like nothing. So just to point out, we talk about distance, but it's not that really far. Okay, now we're going to compare it to a different case where you're going to need 4 cubits, which is already a lot more because each cubit is 6 tfachim. So you're already going to have 24 tfachim. That's a lot different than 3. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Raba, lo shanu ela mina machmetzan, aval mina nadyan arba amot. We now learned that there's 2 types of brechat kopsim. One's a machmetzan, which has something to do with lachmitz, which is like from vinegar, but fermenting. And one is the nadyan. So what are these 2 things? Rashi explains. A machmetzan is where they would soak things. Rashi even says something a little disgusting, which is they would put the soat klavim, okay, we call it what comes out of a dog. They would put that, okay, I'm blanking for my words right now, but they would put that, the dog feces, thank you. The dog feces, they would put that and soak the clothes in them. I don't know, not everybody mentions this dog feces, but anyway, they would soak the clothes for a while. I guess they needed something that would cause it to ferment. Okay, and then it would ferment, and then the stench would be really bad. Plus, there'd be this liquid, sitting there for a while. That you would need 3 tfachim, but minan nadyan, where you would use it for actually for washing the clothing, where you would rub it. You would take the stone and kind of rub it. That you would need 4 amot. Okay, much more. So why is there a difference between them? So basically, one is standing water. The water doesn't spray out. When you're rubbing the clothes, the water sprays out all over, and therefore you would need a much bigger distance. Even though you would think that the first one sounds pretty disgusting, and the stench would be pretty awful, but they seem to be concerned more for the standing water. Tanya Nami Hachi, and here's a braita to support. Okay, so now we're going to have a few versions of the sugya, so let's get straight exactly what happens. The content's all really the same, but how it came about. So according to this, we have Rav Nachman quoting Rabba Ravua, who says, our Mishnah, by the way, is only this type, not the other type. The other type needs more. To which they then bring a braita to support this reading, Tanya Nami Hachi, Nivrechet hakofsim arba amot. Well, let's bring a braita to support, because it's in a different source, it says a different amount for this launderer's pool. Hana don't we say 3 in our Mishnah? So the fact that we have this Mishnah and a braita which say totally different amounts must be a support for Rav Nachman. Okay. Some say the sugya started off differently. It started with a contradiction. Wait, we have these 2 contradictory sources. In order to resolve the difficulty, came Rav Nachman and came up with this distinction. Not that we use the contradiction to support him, but no, that's how he got there in the first place. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, lo kasher, kamen machmetzan, kamen nadyan. So basically, he comes and says, this is from the machmetzan, and this is from the nadyan. Rav Chia bereid Rav Avia matne la behedya. Rav Chia, the son of Rav Avia, actually had a braita, or maybe in our Mishnah, it's not clear, had it say explicitly. Now, I want to point out, just so you're clear, the Mishna and the braita, according to what we've seen until now, one says 3, one says 4, right? 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths, one says 4 cubits. None of them discuss which type of nivrechet kofsim. They use the same word in both places, and we just assumed it must mean 2 different types. But Rav Chia bereid Rav Avia had in his version, it specifically said, Ela in kain herchik misvat machmetzan v'lakotel 3 tfachim. where it said specifically in the Tannaitic source earlier, before Rav Nachman came along, and said you have to distance it from the rim of the machmetzan, which means it clearly and there it said 3 tvachim. The 3 tvachim had specifically to do with the machmetzan and not. It didn't say nivrechet hakofsim in general. That then we said so. That's a bigger support even for Raba bar Avua. Visa besid. So the first issue was just figuring out which nivrechet kofsim and learning that there was another type that had a bigger distance needed. Now we get to the visa besid. Here comes our question. Visa besid tnan, o dilma osa besid tnan. Is it and you have to plaster it, or you have to plaster it? Is it either distance or plaster, or perhaps you need to do both? So the Gemara is going to bring 2 attempts to try to answer this question, and actually is not going to be successful in either attempt. First, they say pshita de visa besid tnan. It's obvious that it's visa besid, that it's and. Why? Why would there be a distinction between the first set of cases and the second set of cases? Therefore, they must be, now, if you go with the version that in the second set of cases, it said or sabasid. So then they're basically saying there's vis sabasid for the first set, o sabasid for the second part, and that's why they're listed separately. Otherwise, le'arvinu v'litninu. You should have just put them all in one list. Right? Okay, so let's just look. The Mishnah should have read, lo yachfor adam bor samuch lebrosh chavero v'lo shiach v'lo ma'ara v'lo amat mayim v'lo nevrechet kofsim v'lo gefer v'lo zevel v'lo melach v'lo siv v'lo slaim mikotlo shel chavero shloshat tvachim elen ken, right? Unless you, right, or sabasid. So why did it list them as 2 separate lists? Because one is vis sabasid and one is o sabasid, right? And that's how we know, water damage we know is very, very damaging, and therefore water damage you need both, right? Just like we all try to insulate our houses, right, to make sure there's good protection from water damage. I'm sorry, sealing, not insulate. It's like we'll get to in a minute. Sealing, we do that to prevent water damage, right? That's much more dangerous or harmful than the other group. So that needs both, whereas that needs only one. But the Gemara rejects that and says, it could very easily have separated them because they wanted you to know there's different categories. First category is water damage. Second category is heat or chemical damage. And that's why they separated them, not because there's any difference between them in terms of the halacha. So that really didn't prove it. Second attempt, Tashma, let's bring a different source, and this is the source we saw, and we're going to do the exact same thing we did to the source the last time we saw it, which is we're going to bring it thinking one thing and then reject and say, no, it means something else. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Sela hababi yadayim, and not that it means something else, but its implications are different than we thought. Sela hababi yadayim, if you're digging in a place where there's very soft ground, zechoper boromikan, v'zechoper boromikan, and each one is digging a bore from a different direction, each one has to distance 3 tvachim from the other as they're digging their pit and has to plaster it. Now, what would you assume? Tama de babi yadayim, halo b'yadayim lo. Here they're going to assume it says visabasid means you need to do both. And if it needs to do both, well, why do you need both? Because the ground is so soft and easily breakable. And that's why you need to be extra careful. But if it wasn't a case like this, you wouldn't need to be extra careful. And that would imply our Mishnah would be fine. We're talking about a regular case, not where the ground is super soft, and therefore either one would be fine. However, the Gemara says, no, you can't imply what you're trying to imply. No, you could say, this is actually the same as for everything else. So obviously then why isolate this case? The reason why they specifically need to isolate this case was to teach you that you might have thought, since the ground is so soft, perhaps 3 tvachim wouldn't be sufficient. And this is just teaching you, actually, halachically, this is no different. 3 tvachim is sufficient, and therefore we have no proof whether both mean en sabasid and it applies to everything, or it means o sabasid and it would be only that, or perhaps this means vis sabasid, ours means o sabasid. These are just all different possibilities of how you could read it, meaning nothing is really able to be proven. and therefore we're going to move on without an answer. Third sugya. מרחיקים את הזפת ואת הגפת ואת הזבל ואת המלח ואת הסלעים וכולי. So now these are all heat-creating things, or perhaps just chemical reactions that cause a problem. Now we're going to say that Tanan Hatam. Well, it says in the Mishna, I mentioned that we had the Gefet in Masechet Shabbat, and now the Gemara is actually going to bring the Mishna in Masechet Shabbat and compare the two Mishnayot and point out two differences. The same list is going to appear in Masechet Shabbat in the fourth chapter, Bamet Tomnim u Bamet Ein Tomnim. Here we're talking about insulating. I told you we'd get back to insulating. If you want to heat up items, the way they would keep the heat, you heat your item up before Shabbat, can't heat it up on Shabbat, so what do? You heat it before Shabbat, and then you completely enclose it in something that insulates it. Now, there's things that you can insulate before Shabbat and there's things you can't use. Things that add heat or on Shabbat, I'm not going to get into all the details there of that, but things that create heat, you can't insulate even before Shabbat, okay? We're going to have an issue even before Shabbat. You can't put in something that's going to insulate it, that adds heat to it, that's completely insulated in it, right? It's not like putting something on a plata, on a hot tray, because that's not, the item isn't insulated within the hot tray. That's something different. That adds heat, but it's not insulated in it. So before Shabbat, you can't insulate in items that add heat to it. And lo and behold, what's the list? The exact same list as by us, with one difference. Again, it's two differences really, because our Mishnah lists something that's not there, and that Mishnah lists something that's not here. So Tananatam, it says there, Bamet Tomnim u Bamet Ein Tomnim. That's how the parak starts out, and then it starts with the list of Ein Tomnim, right? So there's going to be things that you can, and there's things that you can't. Which are the things that you can't? Ein Tomnim lo b'gefet, v'lo b'zevel, v'lo b'melach, v'lo b'seed. Okay, same as us. V'lo b'chol. They skip the slaim, the stones, and they add sand. Bein lachim, bein yivashim, whether they're moist or whether they're dry. So mashna hachi de katani slaim v'lo katani chol, mashna hatim de katani chol v'lo katani slaim. So why the difference? Why is slaim not mentioned there, and why is chol not mentioned here? We're going to have 3 attempted answers. Each time someone's going to reject the previous answer and bring his own answer. We're going to have we're going to have Rav Yosef and Abaye and Rava. Rav Yosef was the teacher of Abaye. Okay, so we're going to have Rav Yosef. Abaye is going to question, which he often does, questions his teacher Rav Yosef. He's going to bring his own answer, and then Rav is going to question Abaye. Okay, Rav Yosef's 3rd generation, Rav and Abaye are 4th generation, but often they engage in discussions and arguments. I'm Rav Yosef. Very obviously, if you don't use it for hatmana, then the Mishnah is not going to mention it. So basically, there's nobody does hatmana, insulating with stones, because they don't insulate with stones. Therefore, it wasn't listed in the Mishnah. But wait, the Mishnah, when it talks about what you can insulate with, mentions, which we're going to read in a minute, or a braita says it actually. Detanya, I'll just read it and then we'll explain. Okay, you can use strips of wool. Coverings of wool. This purple dye. Okay, strips of wool made of purple dye. Also another type of wool. Okay, they happen to be muktzah because they're items that people use for creating clothing. And because of that, or other items, right? And because of that, it's a raw material that doesn't have any use in and of itself. And it's used specifically for creating clothing, which is forbidden to do on Shabbat. So that means you can't move them, but you can insulate them before Shabbat, and then you're going to have to like pull out what it is without actually moving them, okay, because you can't move them. Anyway, that's a very side point. The point here that we're bringing this is to say nobody uses those items for hatmana, but the braita mentions them anyway. So that's not really a good reason that they didn't mention stones, because nobody uses stones for insulating, because they listed all sorts of items that also people don't use. So El Amar Abaye quoting a pasuk from Eov again, Yagid alav re'o, just his friend will tell about it, meaning that even though sand isn't mentioned here, and even though stones aren't mentioned there, we can view these two Mishnayot as quote unquote friends, and each friend can tell about the other, meaning stones really are included in that list as well, and sand is really included in our list as well. It just didn't say it because you could have found it on the other list. Okay, so let's read that inside. Since it's mentioned there, we can apply that to here. Since this is mentioned here, we can apply it to there, even though it didn't explicitly say. To which Rava says that's not a good explanation. I'm really Rava, if you're going to use that theory that, okay, we have similar lists, so whatever's mentioned in one will be mentioned in the other. Well, then we should have, you should have put one list, a complete list with all the items. Let's say in Shabbat, do gefed and melach and seed and etc. Slaim chol. In our Mishnah, just bring the gefed, and you would have learned and then you would have known gefed includes that whole list of items mentioned in Masechet Shabbat. So Rava doesn't really accept Abaye's explanation, and Rava is going to bring the final explanation, which we aren't going to reject. The reason why slaim aren't mentioned there is not just because people don't use them, but because they ruin the pot. If you insulate in stone, okay, now why? Well, it could crack the pot. Some people think it's going to scratch the pot. It's all different reasons. It's unclear. The commentaries disagree about what exactly the stones do to ruin the pot, but basically they're going to ruin a pot. It's not like you don't use it, right? You put wool around it, so maybe nobody does that, but you theoretically could. It wouldn't do anything bad to the pot. But this is actually destructive to the pot, so of course it wasn't going to mention it. And now we still have left to figure out the chol. Why isn't chol mentioned by us? And sand only adds heat if you put it next to something that is already hot, but it doesn't add heat if you put it just in cold ground. It actually makes it cooler. In other words, sand is good for keeping something cold colder, keeping something hot hotter, but it's not going to be a problem to put a pile of sand and store it next to your friend's wall because there's no heat there, so it's not going to create heat. So basically, sand is irrelevant, totally irrelevant to our topic because it wouldn't be a problem at all. So then we've almost fully resolved this. But wait, Rabbi Yoshaya has sand on his list of our Mishnah. In other words, his version of the Mishnah included sand. So we just explained, according to Rava, that there's no problem with putting sand. So how could he have sand on his list? Hatan b'mituna, that's wet sand. And then, according to him, sand really belongs in the first section of the Mishnah. By the way, it didn't say where he had sand on his list. It could be he had it in the first section. Wet sand is something different, right? We all know if you have wet sand standing in your garden, right, and right up alongside your house, and it's going to basically, the water from this wet sand is going to seep into your wall. So, Tana Didan Nami Litneva Lukma b'mituna. So now they ask, well, then why didn't our Mishnah, right, the author of our Mishnah, put it in the first section? To which they say, Hatana le'amat mayim, because it already gave a case similar. Now, it's not at all the same case, but it's the same kind of water damage. Either you have a water channel going through where the water's going to seep in, or you have wet sand where the water's going to seep in. There was no reason to mention both, which begs the question, Gemara is going to ask, well, if there's no reason to mention amat mayim, the water channel, and the wet sand, then why was there a need to mention, right? You could say the same thing. There was no need to mention the launderer's pool, because the launderer's pool, what's the difference between that and a water channel? So that's not a great answer. To which they're going to say, no, hanut sriche, that you really did need. Okay, and now we're going to distinguish. We're going to say you didn't need to mention wet sand. That didn't really add anything new, and therefore it wasn't mentioned, but it's obvious it's included. But you did need to mention the amat mayim and the nivreche kofsim, because you couldn't have learned one from the other. Again, one is a water channel, and one is the launderer's pool. What's the difference? Well, the itana amat mayim mishum dekvia aval nivreche kofsim de lo kvia emalo. The nivreche kofsim was this launderer's pool that sometimes you emptied out and used it for other things. It wasn't always in use. Whereas a water channel, there's always water going through. It was a constant thing. So obviously something that's more of a constant is more of a problem, that it always has water in it. You might not have thought then, you just had that. Maybe it would be okay to have this launderer's pool, which sometimes has water, sometimes doesn't. Or v'item and nivrechet kofsim. So let's go the opposite. Just have nivrechet kofsim, and you would have learned, obviously, also amat mayim. No. Mishum dekavu v'kaime, aval amat mayim lo. The bad part about the nivrechet kofsim is that the water is standing. It's always there. The amat mayim, the water is passing through. And therefore, it's perhaps going to less cause damage than standing water. And that's why, so emalo, you might have thought not the amamayim, and therefore it's sricha. That's why you needed both those cases, but you didn't need the sand. And then again, the sand, why is it in Rabbi Yoshi is listed not here? Because the sand there was talking about wet sand, and we're talking about dry sand, which is in the category of the things that create heat, and sand doesn't create heat unless it's already hot, and therefore it's off this list. And the sla'im aren't on the list in Shabbat because they damage. They're damaging, and therefore, of course, you're not going to do hatman in it because it would be damaging. Okay, that was our third section, which was basically to compare this list to the list in Shabbat and say, let's understand the differences. So now we get to the next section, the third section of our Mishnah, the seeds and the plow, and then we'll get to the urine after that. Well, let's think about the way things work. First, you plow using the plow. Then you plant the seeds. So if you say you can't put the machresha within 3 tvachim of your neighbor, which means you can't plow there, obviously you're not going to plant there, so you don't need to tell me both. Once you can't put the plow there, obviously you can't plant. Well, not necessarily, because b'mapolet yad. There was a way that people planted by hand, where you would basically make some holes in the ground manually without a plow, make a few little holes, and then put the seeds in by hand, which means that you wouldn't plow, and yet you could still put seeds in. So you might think, okay, well, I can't plow within 3 tvachim because I'll ruin the person's wall, but I could plant by hand, and that's not a problem. So it comes to teach you, no, you can't because of the planting. You haven't really figured out what the issue with the seeds are. We'll get there soon. Then they say, well, then if you say you can't plant, now, obviously, then you can't put the plow there, because if you can't put your seeds there, what's the point of plowing if you're not going to plant seeds? So, machresha, why do you need to put machresha? Typically, mishum zra'im. It's the question in the reverse. Why don't you just say, once you can't put seeds there, and obviously you can't plow within 3 tvachim because you're not going to be able to plant anyway. So you don't really need to say the machresha, to which they say, b'choresh le'ilano. Some different interpretations. We'll go with Rashi here, which is, you already had trees there from before, and what you want to do is you want to soften the ground around the trees using the plow, because it's good to help the tree grow better. That you can't do if your tree is within 3 tvachim of the wall. Right? Now Rashi has to say you had a tree there from a long time ago, because otherwise your tree can't be near the wall either because of the neighbor, and we'll get to all of the tree stuff later. But basically, that would also be an issue, right? We talked okay. We mentioned the tree in yesterday's stuff, but also you have to distance the tree a lot from your neighbor. Let's say originally it was your field, the whole thing, then you sold it, then you ended up, then they put a wall up, and now you just want to plow around the tree. You can't do that within 3 tvachim because your plow is going to mess up the wall. Okay, well, there's another problem. If you plant seeds, you're obviously going to have to water it and bring water into your garden all around the edges. So wouldn't that be a problem because of water damage? Well, say they were in Eretz Israel, and Eretz Israel, the pasuk said, you're going to basically be able to live off the rain, even though we know it doesn't always work that way. It's not simple, but you're going to basically drink water from the rain, which means the rainwater is going to water it, which means you don't necessarily, your field could survive with rainwater. You won't necessarily need to bring water, which then would create the water damage. They don't really relate to the fact that if you have seeds, they're growing and the water is getting in the ground and that's going to eventually seep into the neighbor. They don't seem to be worried about that. Lememra, now this all seems to, now they want to get to really why are seeds an issue. Now this seems to imply the reason why you can't plant seeds unless you distance at 3 tvachim is dizraim, turning out amabet, litzdadin kamishtarshe. The roots go out to the sides. And that's the problem. The roots are going to get into the wall, and that's going to wear away at the soil underneath the wall, which will cause the wall to be unstable. But wait, there's a Mishnah in Kilayim which seems to imply that roots of seeds do not go to the sides, they only go down. How do we see this? From a Mishnah in Kilayim about lahavrich et hagefen ba'aretz, that this is where you take a vine and you replant, okay, so there's part of it in the ground, and then you take what's growing and you replant that in a different place in the ground, and then it creates roots and it grows more. Okay, so if when you replanted that vine, that shoot, you took a shoot basically and you replanted it in the ground, you did that and you didn't dig it down 3 tvachim deep, then you can't put a seed on top of it, because the assumption is the seed will grow down and connect with the vine, and that will be a problem. More than 3 tvachim, it's already distance and it's fine. They won't connect with each other and it won't be a problem of mixed breeds. But what is it seen to say? So Betane Allah, there's a braita on this Mishna in Kilayim, which says, Aval zorea et hatzedim elach ve'elach, but you can plant right next to it because we're assuming that the roots go down and the seeds that you're going to put in next to it go downward. They're not going to connect under the ground because they don't grow sideways. Okay, whereas a tree, we're going to see the roots go out and grow a lot sideways, but not in these seeds. So now we're not talking about seeds of a tree, we're talking about seeds of, grains and things like that. So our Mishnah seemed to imply don't plant the seeds because the roots will get over there. At least that's what we thought. But this Mishnah and the braita on it seems to say they go straight down the roots. So Amar Rav Chaga b'shem Rabbi Yossi, the issue with the seeds is not what you thought. What happens when you put the seeds in the ground? They create holes in the space there in the ground soil underneath. It creates these holes. I don't really know. I'm not in agriculture, but apparently, according to what the Gemara is saying, there's holes created in the ground underneath, which then pushes and it creates pressure in the ground, moves the ground underneath off to the sides. That's the off to the sides. And then will affect the ground, the soil under the wall of the neighbor, and that's why you have to distance it 3 tvachim. So the zra'im have to do with that. Okay, now we're going to get into an interesting sugya about urine and men urinating on walls and all sorts of interesting things. So at mei raglayim min hakotel 3 tvachim. So now it says you have to distance urine from the wall 3 tvachim. Amar Raba bar Hana. Mutar la'adam la'ashtim mayim b'tzad kotlo shel chavero dichtiv. Okay, so before we get to the pasuk, Rabba bar Hana says something which we're going to see seems to contradict our Mishnah. He says a person can urinate right next to the wall of a friend without an issue. Now, our Mishnah said you can't have urine next to the wall. You can't put your urine there. Isn't that not urinating on the wall? Where does Rabba bar Hana learn this from? Interesting explanation of this pasuk. So this pasuk talks about Achav. He was the king of Israel. He was a terrible king. He gets punished severely, and God tells him, "I'm going to wipe out from Achav mashtim b'kir, all those who urinate against the wall," which doesn't mean people who specifically urinate against the wall. It's understood by Rabbi bar Hana to mean all men urinate on walls. That's what they do. That's how we define men. Okay, that's a synonym for men, those who urinate on a wall. Interesting. So I'm going to get rid of all the males of Achav's family. Atzur v'azuv b'Yisrael. So what's the atzur and azuv? Atzur seems to be things that are gathered up, meaning his possessions that he collects. And azuv is all of his, all the animals that he leaves out to graze, like azuv, left out. Okay. And b'Yisrael means everyone in Israel is going to know about this. Okay, there's going to be this huge destruction. The males in his family, or I guess in his family, all his possessions and all of his livestock. The Hana. Okay, that was Rabba bar Hana's proof that everybody urinates against the wall. It's a totally normal thing to do. Okay. The Hana, but didn't we learn in our Mishnah? So how do we explain that? To which the answer, hatam b'shofchin. Oh, no. Whole difference. One person urinating at a friend's wall, that's not going to cause a lot of damage. But if you take from your outhouse, and you collected urine in your house or outhouse, and you want to dump it out somewhere, okay, we're learning all about, customs of those days. Men urinated on walls. People dumped, right, their chamber pots. So if you talk about dumping a chamber pot, that you shouldn't do because that's a much larger quantity. That you're not allowed to do next to a wall. Okay, these next few lines are actually erased in some of the versions, but we'll read it anyway. It's pretty straightforward, and then you'll see why many people think it's erased. Tashma, there's another short that says, Lo yishpoch adam mayim b'tzad kotlo shel, excuse me. Lo yishpoch adam mayim b'tzad kotlo shel chavero, elim ken uchit mimenu shlosha tvachim. Okay, some people actually have a different word here. It's not lo yishpoch, it's lo yatil, but let's just read it as lo yishpoch. You shouldn't pour urine next to the kotel chaviro unless you distance shlashat tefachim, which again seems to go against Raba bar Hana, to which they say, of course, that doesn't go again. That says don't pour. He wasn't talking about pouring, he was talking about urinating. Hatam nami b'shofchim, that also was talking about pouring, which again, you could say people got rid of this because it said obviously it was talking about pouring. You didn't need to explain that it was talking about pouring. It says pour. So that's why some people take this version out. Some people have a different word. It's not leishpoch, it's leyatil, which is a little less clear. Anyway, it's the same idea. Tashma, another source. Lo yesh, and with this source, we're actually going to reject Raba bar Hana, which is nice to know that he basically said, okay, fine. We're now going to say you cannot urinate on your friend's wall at all. Okay, thankfully. Tashma lo yashtin adam mayim b'tzad kolo shel chavero elam ki nechit mimenu shlosha tefachim. You can't urinate on your friend's wall. Now this is clear. We're talking about a person urinating and not dumping from a chamber pot because it says lo yashtin, which that's what it means. Don't urinate next to your friend's wall unless you distance yourself 3 tefachim. Bameh dvarim amurim. Well, by the way, which type of wall are we talking about? B'kotel lebenim, if it's with bricks, because bricks is can disintegrate from the urine. If it's a kotel avanim, if it's made of stone, so the urine's not going to wear away at the stone, but the stone is in dirt, soil, and that might mess things up. So what's just as long as you won't damage, the kama tefa, that's a tefa. Okay, so you don't need 3 tefachim, 1 handbreadth is enough. V'shaltsun mutar. If it's stone on stone, then it's totally fine because nothing's going to happen. Tiyuv to Raba bar Hana, tiyuv to which they say this actually is a real knockout to his approach that anyone could just urinate on anyone's wall. From here, it seems clear you can't because again, he didn't distinguish stone wall, brick, whatever. And here it seems clear, at least there's certain walls you cannot urinate on. So they knock out his opinion. So then they say, but ha Raba bar Hana krakamar, but didn't he bring a pasuk to support what he was saying? Hatam hachi kamar. No, what it really meant there is not, okay, and now we're going to erase all the things we said. So number 1, you can't urinate on a friend's wall. And number 2, it really didn't mean mashtim bekir is not a term for all males, but afilu mide didarke lishtune bekir lo shviknale. Even something lowly that generally urinates on a wall, I'm not going to leave even that lowly thing with achav, meaning I'm going to destroy everything of achavs. And what is that? My nihu kalba. What is that? A dog. Okay, we see dogs all the time, right? Urinate in all sorts of places. And that's what we're talking about. We see that more so than men. I mean, once in a blue moon, you do see that kind of thing, but it's less common. It's not all men urinate against walls. And therefore, we're talking about dogs. Mashtim Bakir is a dog, is not a person, and is not a male. I believe they left the females out of this. Anyway, that ends our section where we basically brought Raba bar Hana to say, hey, that contradicts our Mishna, but in the end, right, first we tried to resolve it, and then we actually rejected him completely. And then in the end, we explained the Mishna. Number 1, you can't dump urine there. You also can't, right, based on the other braita, you also can't urinate, even if it's less urine than dumping a whole chamber pot. Okay, now we're going to get totally off topic. We're only going to connect between the sugya and our sugya tomorrow. Okay, in the discussion of this long sugya that we're going to deal with about impurity, we're going to mention something related to what we've been talking about. You'll have to wait till tomorrow for that. So this happens often where they bring in some sugya from somewhere else, and then eventually we circle back and we see how it connects. So the topic here is impurity in the house. Maybe I'll just do a quick summary before we get to this because it's totally disconnected. So let's just get the flow of what we did today. We talked about the nivrechet kofsim, which type we distinguished between 2 types. Then we went to vis sabasid, o sabasid. We brought 2 attempts to answer. We didn't have an answer. We moved to the gefet and the zevel, and that we compared it to the Mishna in Bamet Tomnim. Why is one missing in each one? We resolved that with 3 attempts. Only the 3rd attempt we were successful. Then we discussed the Zra'im and the Machresha, why one and not the, why do you need both? Theoretically, you could have learned one from the other. We had to explain that. And then we got to the Mei Raglayim and what is meant and how does it relate to what Raba bar Hana said, which we then and reject Raba bar Hana entirely. So now we have laws of impurity. If there's a dead body in the house, the whole house is impure. If there's a window, let's say we have a shared wall between my house and your house, there's a dead body in my house, and there's a window. Now, a window, again, meant no glass. Okay, we're talking open window between my house and your house. The tumah goes through the window into your house as well. As long as the window is 1 by 1 handbreadth, small. Okay, the tumah can go through. And then everything in your house becomes impure as well. What if you close up that window with something? So if you close it up with something kind of permanent, then that becomes what we call batel to the window. It becomes as part of the window, really, in which case the window no longer is 1 by 1. Let's say it was 1 by 1 tefach and I stuck something in that's kind of permanent, then it's no longer going to pass impurity through. But if it's something I put in temporarily, then it doesn't block the tumah at all, even while it's in. Okay, that's the first thing you have to know. So I'll start with that as our background. We'll learn more things as we go through the sugya. So Rav Tuvi Bar Kisna, Amar Rav Tuvi Bar Kisna, Amar Shmuel, he says in the name of Shmuel, Rakik enoma ma'et b'chalona. Rakik is like a wafer type thing. It's like a flat bread. If you put that in the wall, in the window, it doesn't make it any smaller. Why? The assumption is because you're going to take it out and eat it. Okay, it's something that's useful. So something useful, you're going to stick in a window, you're going to take it back out of the window. So my area, right, by the way, I'm thinking like you put it there on a windowsill. You didn't necessarily put there to cover up your window, but in the end, if the window was 1 by 1 and now this is taking up space on your windowsill, then that's actually blocking your window. But it's not considered a block because it's not going to be permanent. My area rakik afilu avenami. Why did you give the example of a thin wafer? Why don't you give like a fat roll? Okay, right? These are all breads that are flat bread or thick bread. Right? Thick bread, I'm going to take out and eat. And it's still, right, it would be a bigger, unique halacha to say, a bigger chidush, as we say, because even though it's thick and it blocks the wall better because of its thickness, it's still not considered a block in the wall, even though it really does block the wall better than a thin wafer. So why don't you say that? Afilu avenami, you should have said something thicker. So lo mebaya kamar. Actually, it's the reverse of what you thought. Both of them really don't block the wall, but they wanted to teach you lo mebaya ave. You don't even need to teach a thick roll because obviously, since it's still good, right? You're obviously going to take it out and eat it, and therefore it doesn't block the opening, even when it's in, right? Because you will eventually take it out. Okay, kamashma. Yeah, a rakik is very thin. It could easily get ruined in the window. So you might have thought that unlikely you're going to take it out of the window. Once you put it in the window, so it's unlikely you're going to take it out and eat it because it probably will get disgusting. It comes to teach you, no, still it doesn't cancel it doesn't block the tumah doesn't make your window smaller because you probably still will eventually take it out, even though theoretically you might have thought it might get ruined easily. So that's a bigger chiddush, the rakik. Now they say, why didn't you just say something much simpler, which is, and I didn't tell you this halakha because I don't want to confuse you with too many new things, but now we're going to learn another thing that doesn't block a window, even if it's permanently there, would be something that itself can become impure. Now, if you have stuff in the house, anything that's susceptible to impurity will become impure, the dead bodies there. So if that item's in the window that's impure itself and it blocks your window and it's permanent, let's say, it's not going to block impurity from going through because it itself conducts impurity, can contract impurity and therefore pass it on. So it doesn't block your window if it's a davar shemakabel tumah. Now, what is makabel tumah? Food is one of the items that, right, we're always saying, right, a rishon pass it on to a sheni only if it's food and drink, right? Food is always susceptible to impurity. Well, always, as long as one thing, we'll get to that in a minute. But right now they're going to say, Chotzeitz means it blocks. Now, this doesn't block impurity from going through because it itself is susceptible to impurity. So it's going to become impure, in which case, of course, the tumah is going to go through that window because it itself, what's blocking it is impure. So they say, well, how does food become susceptible to impurity? Remember, it has to come in contact with a liquid that can, first it has to come in contact with one of the 7 liquids. Yad Shachat Dam is the Rashi Tevot, water and wine and a bunch of other things. Anyway, nilosh b'mei peiro. So they say this dough did become wet because it was right, flour, let's say, with a liquid, but you used fruit juice if we're talking about if you use fruit juice to make your wafer, then the fruit juice doesn't pass on impurity, and therefore it won't be food that's susceptible to impurity. Now we bring a contradiction. Now here's a Mishna in Ohalot, which is going to raise a problem with what Shmuel said. Because he says here, you have a box filled with teven, with hay, or a chavit, a barrel filled with grogrot, filled with figs, hamunachim b'chalon, that's in the window. So rowan, we check. Now, a vessel is susceptible to impurity. All vessels can be, right? Most vessels can be impure. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Vessels carry impurity. So the vessel itself is going to carry impurity, which means this isn't blocking the window. But if you took them out, would these be able to sit well in the windowsill? If they could, then the tevin and the grogrot are chotzitzim, they block the window. Now, why is this different from what we just said? Tevin you take out because you're going to give it to your horses to eat or your animals to eat. And the grogrot you're going to eat also. So it's like the rakik, and the rakik, he said, is not chotzitzim, it doesn't block. And this does block. So that's going to be our problem. So they say, right, being lab, if not, then chotzitzim, then ein chotzitzim, because the barrel, you would need the barrel. Then the barrel is significant, and then the barrel or the basket is basically going to pass on impurity. That's just a side point. So now they get to our question. You could use it for your animal, in which case you're going to take it out. So why are you saying if it could sit in by itself, it basically becomes part of the window, closes it up, and then the impurity doesn't pass? They say bisaria, it's rotten tevin. Latina, you could still use it to make bricks, which means you'll take it out of the window, right? As long as it's useful, you're going to take it out. It has thorns in it and stuff, which you can't make bricks out of that. Chaze lasaka, you could still burn it. Bimituna, it's wet. We had that word earlier today. Chaze lahasek, you could still put it in a bonfire because it'll quickly dry and be able to be used. Most people don't make big bonfires, so therefore it's not relevant. What about grogrot? Hachazele, Amar Shmuel b'shei trifu. Shmuel explains that, which is reasonable. He would explain that Mishna because it contradicts what he said. It's worm infested, and then you're not going to eat them. If they're worm infested and they're in the window, that's what the Mishna means. And he also said his version was b'shei trifu. In the Mishnah it said in his version b'shei trifu. Okay, it was worm infested. So that resolved our question, but we still are going to have a lot about the sugya, and eventually we'll connect it back. That's it for today. I already did the summary, so we're going to stop here. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov. Maybe a week with Besorot. Still waiting.